So back on September 20th, you heard me chat with George Parry. George Parry was completely new to me up until about 3 weeks before that date. And I interviewed him after receiving an article that he had written in the American Spectator dissecting the George Floyd video, medical examiner's report, and a transcript of that video from the officer's body cam. You remember, we as a public did not see the officer's body cam until about 3 months after the events of May 25th, 2020. I was so riveted by that article, I had to call George Parry and find out, are you for real? He had him on the show September 20th, and he assesses that none of the 4 officers in the George Floyd case should have been charged. His research inspired a documentary for my next guest, Fleming Fuller. Fleming has been a documentarian for like 5 decades. One of his documentaries, Murder One, was one of the first ones that put him on the map. That and others have been made into films. You can look them up and look up his repertoire because we want to spend as much time as we can chatting with him. Fleming Fuller, it's under sort of crazy circumstances we talked today because just this past week, Derek Chauvin, the officer charged with second-degree murder in the George Floyd death, was released on bond. Some people had issues with him being released on bond. But tell me why you were inspired by the articles George Parry wrote to do your documentary.
Roshini, I think I had the very common reaction to the first view of the terrible scene on the streets of your city of this officer with his knee apparently on the neck of this man. It was ghastly. It was highly disturbing. And I didn't really dwell on the case that much. It wasn't something you wanted to linger on. And then after I read George Parry's article, it was an entirely different take. I realized that there was an interesting sequence of events and that there was overbearing political pressure. Normally in any kind of use of force situation, there is a protracted period of investigation. Officers are reassigned to desk duties. They turn in their firearms, whatever. And this didn't happen. The mayor called for the firing of these men the next day. And then 4 days after the death of Floyd, which was absolutely a tragedy, these men were indicted with murder charges and this indictment occurred 2 days before the toxicology report had been returned. And the toxicology report is the most important aspect of this situation because it showed that Mr. Floyd had ingested a absolutely lethal dose of fentanyl. There was also methamphetamine, and that he died of a drug overdose, not any pressure that was put on his neck.
And I point out again, that video of the knee on the neck will go down in infamy. I mean, it is terrible to look at. But as I talked about with George Parry on September 20th, that actually comes in. That particular video is several minutes into the actual incident. And George Floyd was saying he couldn't breathe long before that unfortunate knee on the neck.
Absolutely. You know, the thing that is shocking is that from the body-worn camera footage, when we first encounter, when Officer Lane comes up, approaches the vehicle, taps on the window, within about 12 minutes or so, he's dead. It wasn't apparent to the officers, it wasn't apparent to us, but that he was deteriorating and was in a state of verbal loops, paranoia. It was confused when they finally got him out of the car. Well, first of all, he wasn't able to comply. You know, at no time was he aggressive, violent. I think he was non-compliant, difficult, because he couldn't do otherwise. He was severely impaired. He could barely walk. He collapsed a couple of times. So this is a situation that evolved very rapidly, and that people have asked, why didn't they know that he was on drugs? Well, first of all, he denied being on drugs. And then when it became more and more apparent that he might be, they had this violent struggle to put him in the back of the squad car, and he banged his head. They immediately called for the EMS to deal with that. And then after he was so paranoid and disturbed about being put in the car, claiming he was claustrophobic, but there was bizarre aspects. He asked him if he could be put in the front of the car. Now, that, of course, was ludicrous, but it wasn't a joke. His paranoia was such that he was desperate. They needed to put him in the car because they needed to continue the investigation. They had been called because a counterfeit $20 bill had been passed. But Floyd was so disturbed, they decided that he asked to be taken out. But while he was still outside the car and then struggling inside the car, he started saying, "I can't breathe." And I think he said it 7 times before he was on the ground. And the "I can't breathe" was not due to any pressure on his neck or larynx. There was no damage in the autopsy that would indicate any kind of strangulation. But
let's get back into why you wanted to make this film. I'm talking with Fleming Fuller. He's a documentarian. His new film just out called Who Killed George Floyd. You will be able to see it on our Facebook properties. I will post it on the Roshini Rajkumar page after the show today, and you will see it on the WCCO Radio Facebook page. And those who are with us on Facebook Live saw some video from the film right here. We are live on the radio, live on Twitter, live on Facebook. And Fleming, it's important to note that there are, and I didn't even know this because I haven't Googled documentaries. I just assumed the storyline really hasn't ended. So I didn't know there were other documentaries that came out earlier this summer. But you say those documentaries from June or so are incomplete. Why?
There is absolutely no utilization because it hadn't been released, which is very troubling in and of itself, from the body cameras of the investigating officers. There were 3 cameras that were operative. Chavin's camera was running initially, but it was dislodged in the struggle, and so it didn't play a large role. But if you see all of the footage, if you look at what happened in the 6 or 8 minutes leading up to his being on the ground, restrained, you get an entirely different picture of the episode, and also it's very revealing. These officers are incredibly conscientious. They're new. 3 of them are rookies, but yet they treated him with deference, with patience. They didn't lose their temper with him. They weren't rough with him.
And let me reality check that comment on you, because there are a lot of people who would say that they weren't polite, they weren't conscientious. So how do you sort of help regular people view or listen to or even hear these kinds of comments?
Well, the most contentious aspect initially was the brandishing of the sidearm by Officer Lane. And what he was doing was trying to ascertain if Mr. Floyd was armed. He had all this furtive movement. His right hand was not visible, and he wasn't complying when the officer was saying, "Show me your hands, show me your hands," which is standard operating procedure in any situation like this. And Floyd, I don't think, was trying to be difficult. He was impaired, and he was reticent to do this simple compliance. And he escalated verbally, cursed a bit to get his attention, but he wasn't mistreated or verbally abused after that, once he started showing his hands, as it were.
Fleming, we only have a couple more minutes with you. I'm talking with Fleming Fuller. His new documentary is out now. It's called Who Killed George Floyd? And in it, he features George Parry, who we heard from a few weeks ago on this show, and their assessment that the officers should not have been charged in the death of George Floyd. Real quickly, why did you want to make this film? You are not connected to Minneapolis. You're a Southerner, you're a Texan, you live in North Carolina now. Why?
I've always been interested in the criminal justice system. My first documentary was the story of 6 men on death row in Georgia and North Carolina. And when I started the process, I thought it was about death row, but I quickly realized it was something that was more interesting to me. And that is, why do people commit homicides? And who are these people? And how do they live with it? How do they justify it? How do they rationalize it? And so from that time, I've always been intrigued by these situations. And the misrepresentation in this case was compelling to me to try to set the record straight. So that's why I contacted George Parry, because I read his piece, as you did.
And he's a former federal prosecutor and state prosecutor.
Absolutely.
He also oversaw the state's office for the unit that investigated police brutality and misconduct. So he also, as a Pennsylvania Philadelphian, had no horse in the Minnesota race or the Minneapolis race. So his assessment, very compelling. I found it compelling in his article. Let's quickly talk, before we have to say goodbye, about Keith Ellison. George Parry, when I spoke with him on September 20th, says there's prosecutorial misconduct in this. These officers should not have been charged. Give us your assessment of that as the filmmaker. You pieced together all the different videos, from the cameras on the officers to street footage to people's individual cell phones to that infamous Facebook video.
Prosecutorial misconduct is a real problem. I've dealt with it over the years in a number of situations. In many respects, it's as dangerous, or more so in some aspects, than police misconduct, because so many things can go wrong. There was an overzealousness on the part of the Attorney General of your state, I believe, because they hadn't waited for any formal investigation, and certainly didn't have in hand the toxicology report, which is the key to understanding this entire situation, because Mr. Floyd was not behaving in a rational manner. He was highly disturbed. He wasn't violent, but he was non-compliant. And then he ultimately became very sad as his physical deterioration progressed. So I think the Attorney General should have waited. There's a presumption of innocence in this country, and there's a reason for it, and it's important. And in this case, these men were branded murderers, which has ruined their lives and brought about terrible unrest and violence in this country, which is misplaced.
I will always ask, if this video just had been released sooner, if we had listened to the medical examiner's report, would my city not have burned down? That is a question that I will always ask. Fleming Fuller, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Your film, Who Killed George Floyd, can be seen. People can easily find it at Centaur Filmworks. That's CENTAUR filmworks.com. You can Google it. You can find it on the Roshini Rajkumar and the WCCR Radio Facebook pages. Fleming, thank you for joining us. And I know you're working on expanded versions of this story, so we'll look for those in the months ahead.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Thanks for joining.